In Baek Jin-Woo's house, everything had its place. Clean, quiet, and perfect. I thought I was part of the furniture, a silent fixture in a black dress and white apron, until his cold fingers lifted my chin and he saw the one thing I couldn't scrub away: Marcus's handiwork. The pressure of his thumb against my jaw was light, yet it felt like an anchor, grounding me in a moment I had spent weeks trying to avoid. I had perfected the art of the downward gaze, keeping my neck bowed and my voice a mere whisper in the vast, echoing halls of the estate. But under the unforgiving clarity of the morning sun streaming through the library windows, my carefully applied concealer had failed me. The mottled purple shadow on my cheekbone was laid bare, a stark blemish on the sterile perfection of his world. Jin-Woo didn't move. He stood so still he seemed carved from the same dark marble as the foyer. His eyes, usually as unreadable as a deep well, narrowed into slits of lethal focus. I could feel the heat radiating from him, a controlled, simmering rage that made the air in the room feel heavy and thin. My heart hammered against my bruised ribs, each beat a sharp reminder of the violence I'd endured just hours ago in the cramped apartment I called home. I tripped, Mr. Baek. I stammered, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. The stairs in my building are poorly lit. It was a clumsy mistake. The silence that followed was suffocating. He didn't blink, his gaze tracing the jagged line of the bruise with a clinical, predatory intensity. He knew. A man like Baek Jin-Woo, a man who navigated the treacherous waters of the Seoul underworld and built an empire on the bodies of his enemies, knew exactly what the imprint of a fist looked like. "You are a poor liar, Sable," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous silk. It wasn't a scolding. It was a statement of fact that chilled me to the bone. Mistakes happen to furniture. This was a choice made by a man who thinks he can touch what is under my roof. He finally released my chin, but the ghost of his touch lingered like a brand. He turned his back to me, looking out toward the manicured gardens, his shoulders squared with a terrifying, purposeful discipline. He didn't ask for a name. He didn't offer a tissue or a kind word. He simply reached for the obsidian-handled letter opener on his desk, his movements fluid and precise. "Go to your quarters," he commanded, his back still turned. "And Sable, lock the door. Do not answer it for anyone but me." I fled, my soft-soled shoes silent on the marble, but as I reached the hallway, I heard the faint metallic click of a burner phone being flipped open. I realized then that the silence of the Baek estate wasn't just peace. It was the quiet of a predator waiting for the sun to go down. By tomorrow, my bruise would still be there, but the man who gave it to me would be nothing but a memory. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to this channel. Click the notification bell and give thumbs up. Tell me where you're watching from. I will love to see Seoul Syndicate romance family stretch across cities, countries, and time zones. Every of your clicks, comments, every bit of your love helps us to keep unraveling these dangerous love stories and high-stakes betrayals together. So find your own quiet space, off the lights, and then ready. Let's go. The stinging scent of ammonia and industrial bleach burned my nostrils as I moved in rhythmic, agonizing circles, scrubbing the marble foyer of the Baek estate until my reflection stared back at me like a ghost. This was the art of disappearing. In a house of this magnitude, perfection was the only requirement, and perfection required being invisible. I had spent 8 months mastering the walk, a soft heel-to-toe glide that made no sound on the polished stone, and the gaze, a perpetual 45-degree angle toward the floor that signaled both humility and a lack of curiosity. But today, invisibility was a survival tactic, not just a job description. A dull, throbbing ache radiated from my jaw down to my collarbone, a reminder of Marcus's heavy-handed goodbye this morning. He'd been in a foul mood since the sun came up, fueled by a night of cheap whiskey and the bitter resentment he carried for the very job that kept us fed. When I dared to ask for the rent money he'd already gambled away, he'd reminded me of my place with a closed fist. I kept my breathing shallow, mechanical, careful not to expand my lungs too far against the ribs that protested with every movement. The fluorescent lights in the service corridor were unforgiving, casting harsh, clinical shadows that seemed determined to expose me. I had spent 20 minutes in the staff bathroom before my shift began, hunched over a cracked mirror with a palette of professional-grade concealer. I'd layered the thick, peach-toned cream over the mottled purple evidence on my cheekbone, blending until the edges vanished into my skin. It was a mask I wore with the same practiced ease as my black and white uniform. To the rest of the world, I was just Sable Monroe, the girl who cleaned the baseboards and polished the silver. I was a blank slate, a woman without a history or a home beyond these walls. The silence of the estate was my only sanctuary, a stark contrast to the chaotic, loud violence of the apartment I shared with a man who counted my bruises like trophies. Here, under the watchful, cold eyes of the security cameras, I was safe because I was nothing. I wrung out my cloth, the water gray and murky, and felt a bead of sweat trickle down my temple. I wiped it away quickly, terrified it might streak the makeup and reveal the broken girl beneath the pristine Maid. I heard the distant, muffled chime of the private elevator. Exactly 7:30 a.m. My stomach clenched with a familiar, sharp anxiety. Mr. Baek was descending. I shifted my weight, tucking my trembling hands behind my back, and lowered my head even further, praying that the shadows of the foyer would be enough to keep my secret buried for one more day. The heavy oak doors at the end of the long corridor swung open with a muffled thud, and the atmosphere in the hallway shifted instantly. It was as if the temperature had dropped 10 degrees, the air becoming thin and sharp. I didn't need to look at the clock to know it was exactly 7:30 a.m. Baek Jin-Woo moved with a terrifying rhythmic precision, his custom Oxford striking the marble with a weight that seemed to vibrate through the soles of my feet. Usually, he passed me like I was part of the architecture, a silent shadow in a black and white uniform. But today, the rhythm of his footsteps faltered. The sound stopped directly in front of me. My heart hammered against my bruised ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I kept my gaze fixed on the tips of his polished shoes, my hands gripping the damp cleaning cloth until my knuckles turned white. "Good morning, Mr. Baek," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the roar of blood in my ears. "The library has been prepared, and your tea is waiting." He didn't answer. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until I felt the air shift. A hand moved, a blur of motion that was both fluid and absolute, and his fingers caught my chin. His touch was cold, his grip firm but not rough, forcing my head up until I had no choice but to look at him. Jin-Woo stood tall and controlled, his dark suit perfectly tailored to a frame that radiated discipline and quiet menace. His expression was a mask of restrained intensity, his narrowed eyes tracking the line of my jaw with a predatory focus. I saw the moment he found it, the slight streak in the concealer where sweat had thinned the mask, revealing the mottled purple shadow beneath. His jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his cheek. The air around us felt like a static charge before a storm. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't offer sympathy. A man like Jin-Woo, who had built an empire on the calculated application of violence, didn't deal in pity. He dealt in territory. "Who?" The word was a low, smooth vibration, cultured yet carrying the edge of a sharpened blade. It wasn't a request. It was a command for the name of the man who had dared to mark what belonged under his roof. "It was nothing, sir," I stammered, my breath hitching as I tried to pull back, but his grip was unyielding. I was clumsy. "The stairs. Sable." He cut me off, his voice dropping into a register of pure, focused rage that made my knees weak. He leaned closer, his dark eyes burning into mine with a terrifying protectiveness. "I will ask you once more. Who touched you?" I fled the hallway the moment he released my chin, my soft-soled shoes slapping against the marble in a frantic, uneven rhythm that betrayed my composure. I didn't stop until I reached the heavy door of the servants' quarters and threw myself into the sterile, cramped silence of my room. Shaking, I leaned my back against the wood, my breath hitching in my throat as I clutched my stomach. The air in my small room felt thick with the weight of what had just happened. For months, I had lived by a single rule: be invisible. If I was invisible, I was safe. If I was invisible, the two worlds I inhabited, The cold, billionaire perfection of the Baek estate and the humid, violent chaos of my apartment with Marcus would never touch. But now Jin-Woo had seen. He had reached across that professional divide and touched the one thing I was desperate to keep hidden. Terror, cold and sharp, crawled up my spine. In my experience, attention from powerful men never ended well. I was certain I had just cost myself the only job that kept my mother's medical bills paid and gave me a few hours of peace each day. I imagined Jin-Woo calling HR, telling them his maid was damaged goods or a distraction. I sank onto the edge of my narrow bed, staring at my trembling hands, waiting for the inevitable knock that would signal my exile back into Marcus's unchecked reach. Meanwhile, 3 floors above me in the soundproofed sanctuary of the library, the atmosphere was not one of bureaucracy, but of war. Baek Jin-Woo stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his reflection in the glass as sharp and lethal as a blade. He didn't look like a businessman anymore. The minimalist suit now seemed like armor for a predator. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, black burner phone, a device that didn't exist on any official record. He dialed a number from memory, his thumb hovering over the screen for only a second before the connection was made. When he spoke, his voice had lost its cultured English lilt. He spoke in rapid, guttural Korean, the sounds harsh and authoritative. "It's me," he said, his eyes fixed on a distant point on the horizon where the city skyline met the gray morning sky. "There is a man, Marcus Thorne. He lives in the 4th District, apartment 4B. He paused, listening to the voice on the other end, his expression remaining a mask of terrifying, frozen calm. "I don't want a discussion," Jin-Woo interrupted, his voice dropping into a register that would have made the bravest men in Seoul tremble. "I want him removed, not discouraged, not warned. Erase. Do it before the sun sets, and make sure he understands exactly whose shadow he stepped into." He ended the call with a clinical click and set the phone on the desk. He didn't feel remorse, and he didn't feel hesitation. He simply adjusted his cuffs, his mind already moving to the next task, as if he had just ordered the pruning of a dead branch in his garden. The vow was made in the silence. No one touched what belonged to the house of Baek. Marcus kicked the door of his apartment open, the stench of stale beer and unwashed laundry greeting him like a familiar rot-filled hug. He was late, his pockets empty after a disastrous run at the local underground parlor, and his temper was a frayed wire sparking in the dark. He expected Sable to be there, hunched over the stove or scrubbing some corner of the floor so he could vent the day's failures onto her shoulders. But the apartment was silent. The irritation flared into a dull, hot roar in his chest. He reached for his phone, ready to unleash a barrage of threats that would ensure she came crawling home in tears, but a sudden glare of light through the cracked window stopped him. 2 matte black SUVs had pulled up to the curb with the synchronized grace of predators. They didn't belong in this neighborhood. They were too clean, too expensive, too lethal. Marcus felt a cold prickle of unease slide down his spine. He stepped toward the window, his hand hovering over the glass, just as the back doors of the vehicle swung open. 4 men stepped out. They didn't look like the street thugs Marcus ran with. They wore dark, minimalist suits and moved with a terrifying military precision. Their faces were masks of professional indifference. Before Marcus could even process the threat, the front buzzer of the apartment complex screamed, a long, continuous note that sounded like a death knell. Panic, sharp and sudden, replaced his bravado. He scrambled toward the back fire escape, his boots thumping against the floorboards, but the window wouldn't budge. It was jammed, as if the very building had decided to trap him. He turned back toward the door just as the lock clicked. It didn't break. It simply opened, as if the men possessed a key to every secret he owned. The leader stepped inside, his eyes tracking Marcus with a clinical, predatory focus. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He simply held up a burner phone, showing Marcus a single image. Sable, standing in the foyer of the Baek estate, her chin held high by Jin-Woo's hand. Marcus tried to scream, to bargain, to fight, but the air was sucked out of the room. 2 men grabbed him by the arms, their grip like iron manacles. They moved him toward the door with practiced ease, as if they were merely removing a piece of trash that had been left in the hallway too long. By midnight, the street was empty again. The matte black SUVs were gone, leaving no tire marks, no witnesses, and no trace of the struggle. Marcus Thorne's name was still on the mailbox, but inside apartment 4B, the air was still and cold. He hadn't just been taken. He had been erased. The world continued to turn, unaware that a monster had been swallowed by a much larger, much more disciplined shadow. Marcus had vanished into the silence of the Baek family's reach, and for the first time in years, the city felt a little quieter. The estate was tomb quiet when the heavy front doors finally groaned open, admitting the damp chill of the midnight air. I had spent the last 5 hours in a state of suspended animation, sitting on the edge of my narrow bed, flinching at every phantom sound. I shouldn't have been up, but the hypervigilance wouldn't let me sleep. My body was an instrument tuned to the frequency of Jin-Woo's arrival, and when I heard the low hum of his car in the driveway, I rose mechanically to prepare his tea. It was a role I hid behind, a way to anchor my trembling hands. I was in the library when he entered. The room was bathed in the amber glow of low-slung lamps, casting long skeletal shadows across the rows of leather-bound books. Jin-Woo looked exactly as he had that morning, tailored, immaculate, and terrifyingly calm. He didn't look like a man who had spent the night in the dark corners of the city. He looked like a king returning to his throne. My breath hitched as I stepped forward, the silver tray rattling slightly in my grip. I set the delicate porcelain cup on the low table beside him. The steam rose in a lazy curl, carrying the scent of jasmine into the heavy air. As I reached out to adjust the saucer, the movement caught my eye. There, on the pristine white linen of his right cuff, was a single dark smudge. It wasn't larger than a coin, but against the starkness of his sleeve, it screamed. It was a deep, brownish red, the unmistakable color of iron and salt. My heart skipped a beat, a cold realization washing over me that made my knees feel like water. I stared at the spot, my vision tunneling until the rest of the world blurred away. Jin-Woo noticed the direction of my gaze. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull his arm away. Instead, he looked at the blood with a clinical indifference, as if it were merely a stray ink blot from a fountain pen. He reached out, his long fingers curling around the handle of the teacup, and took a slow, deliberate sip. "The tea is excellent, Sable," he said. His voice a low, smooth vibration that seemed to settle the frantic pounding in my chest. I swallowed hard, my voice caught in the back of my dry throat. "Mr. Baek. Marcus. He didn't come home tonight. He didn't call." Jin-Woo set the cup back down on the saucer with a soft, final clink. He looked up at me, his dark eyes holding mine with an intensity that felt like a promise and a warning all at once. The quiet menace was gone, replaced by a terrifying, absolute certainty. "He won't be calling," Jin-Woo said quietly. His expression remained a mask of ironclad discipline, but there was a flicker of something almost protective in the depths of his pupils. "He is no longer a factor in your life, Sable. Not tonight. Not ever again." The silence that followed was different than the one before. It wasn't the silence of fear, but the heavy, ringing silence that follows a sudden explosion. I looked at the blood on his cuff again, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like running. I felt a strange, dark comfort in the shadow of the monster who had just killed mine. The transition happened with a sudden, surgical precision that was typical of Jin-Woo's world. Within 48 hours of Marcus's disappearance, the bustling morning sounds of the estate, the clinking of other maids' trolleys and the low chatter of the kitchen staff, simply ceased. I stood in the center of the grand foyer, clutching my dusting cloth like a relic of a past life, staring at the unnatural stillness. The house felt larger, colder, and yet, for the first time, it felt entirely mine to breathe in. Jin-Woo descended the staircase, his movements fluid and his expression as unreadable as ever. He didn't stop until he was directly in front of me, his presence a towering pillar of shadow and expensive cologne. "The staff has been compensated and dismissed," he said. His voice a low, smooth vibration that brooked no argument. From this moment on, you are the only one I trust within these walls, Sable. You will no longer be a maid. You will be the soul of this house. I looked down at my simple black and white uniform, the symbol of my invisibility, but he placed a hand over mine, stilling my nervous fingers. No more hiding, he whispered. The rebuilding began that very afternoon. It started with a woman who arrived with a medical bag. Her eyes kind and her hands professional. She didn't ask questions about the fading purple on my cheek or the tenderness of my ribs. She simply treated them with cooling salves and gentle care that made me want to weep. Then came the boxes. Heavy ivory-colored cartons filled with silks, cashmeres, and soft leathers in shades of cream, emerald, and deep midnight blue. They were clothes meant for a woman who was seen, not a ghost who blended into the marble. Jin-Woo watched from the doorway as I touched a silk gown, my fingers trembling. I felt a strange vertigo, the shame of my old life fighting against the terrifying luxury of the new one. I was no longer a survivalist scavenging for peace in the cracks of a violent relationship. I was being forged into something else, something precious and protected. Why me? I asked, the words barely a breath. Jin-Woo stepped into the room, his gaze intense and proprietary. Because you survived a monster, he said quietly, and only someone who has known the dark can appreciate the light I intend to build around you. He reached out, his thumb tracing the now healing line of my jaw. The gesture was no longer a command. It was a promise. I wasn't just his employee anymore. I was his investment, his secret, and his only vulnerability. In the silence of the empty mansion, I realized that the maid had died along with Marcus, and someone new was beginning to wake up. The sanctuary of the estate had a way of blurring the edges of reality, making me forget that the man who draped me in emerald silk was the same man who commanded an empire of shadows. My healing was nearly complete. The bruises on my ribs had faded to faint yellow clouds, and the hollow ache in my jaw was gone. But Jin-Woo's protection was a heavy veil, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a desperate need to breathe air that didn't smell of his expensive sandalwood. He had granted the request with a silent, searching look, sending me out in a nondescript black sedan with only one driver. It was supposed to be a simple trip, a visit to the small, sun-drenched florist shop near the park where my mother used to take me. I stepped onto the sidewalk, the crisp city air hitting my face, feeling a fleeting sense of the woman I used to be. But the air changed. The city's noise, the honking cabs and distant sirens, suddenly felt discordant, like a radio being tuned to a dead frequency. I was reaching for a bouquet of white lilies when a shadow fell over the display, cold and suffocating. "You have a delicate look about you," a voice rasped. It wasn't the smooth, cultured silk of Jin-Woo's voice, nor was it Marcus's erratic growl. This was a sound like dry earth shifting over a grave. Turn slowly. Standing too close was a man in a gray wool coat, his eyes as pale and sharp as shards of glass. He didn't look like a common thug. He looked like a predator who had found a weakness in a rival's armor. Behind him, a second man moved to block my path back to the sedan. "Baek Jin-Woo thinks he can clear the board and start a new game," the man whispered, leaning in until I could smell the metallic scent of gun oil. "He thinks he can hide his heart in a fortress and call it a secret. Tell your master that Victor sends his regards." He reached out not to strike me, but to pluck a single petal from the lilies in my hand. He crushed it between his thumb and forefinger, the white juice staining his skin. "Marcus was a small, messy mistake. But you are a declaration of war." The panic that surged through me was different than the fear I'd felt with Marcus. That had been the fear of a broken bone. This was the fear of being the epicenter of a cataclysm. As they retreated into the crowd as quickly as they had appeared, I stood frozen, the lilies trembling in my grip. I realized then that I hadn't truly escaped the dark. I had simply traded a small, localized storm for a global hurricane. Marcus had wanted to own my body, but these men, and perhaps even Jin-Woo, were playing for my soul. I wasn't just a woman anymore. I was a target, a message written in the ink of a Mafia war. As I scrambled back into the safety of the car, I looked at the driver's stoic reflection and knew that the piece of the Baek estate was just a different kind of cage. When I returned to the estate, the lilies were limp in my shaking hands, their white petals bruised and weeping. I didn't have to say a word. Jin-Woo took one look at my pale face and the frantic pulse at my throat, and the air in the room curdled into something lethal. He didn't offer comfort. He offered mobilization. Within minutes, the quiet sanctuary of the estate transformed into a command center. Men I had never seen, silent stone-faced soldiers in dark suits, materialized from the shadows of the grounds, their movements a synchronized dance of preparation. Jin-Woo didn't hide the truth from me anymore. He didn't usher me to my room or shield my eyes. He sat at the head of the long mahogany table in the library, a mapping of the city's underworld projected against the wall. His expression carved from ice. He was no longer just the man who bought me silk. He was the dragon of the Baek Syndicate, and he was preparing for a purge. The war came at midnight. I watched from the high balcony of the library as the black SUVs rolled out like a funeral procession. But the true weight of his protection didn't hit me until the early hours of the morning, when the garage doors hummed open and the scent of gunpowder and ozone filled the lower levels. I found Jin-Woo in the private gym, his jacket discarded, his white shirt translucent with sweat and stained with a violence that made the blood on his cuff from days ago look like a minor accident. He was standing over a man, the one from the florist's shop, the one who had crushed the lily. The man was unrecognizable now, a heap of broken pride and red ruin. I should have turned away. I should have felt the same nausea that Marcus's outbursts had always triggered. But as I watched Jin-Woo lean down, his voice a low, terrifying rasp as he demanded the location of Victor's remaining assets, I felt a strange, cold clarity. Jin-Woo wasn't striking out because he lacked control. He was applying pressure with the surgical precision of a man protecting his heart. Every blow was a barrier he was building around me. When he finally looked up and saw me standing in the doorway, the feral light in his eyes didn't dim, but it changed. He didn't move toward me, perhaps afraid of the blood on his hands, but his gaze held me with a desperate, proprietary intensity. "I told you," he said, his chest heaving as he reached for a towel to wipe his knuckles. "In this house, what is mine is sacred. They will never touch you again, Sable. I will burn this city to the ground before I let another shadow fall across your face." I looked at the broken man on the floor and then at the monster who had done it for me. For the first time, I understood that true safety wasn't the absence of violence. It was being the only thing the most dangerous man in the room was willing to die for. I didn't run. I stepped into the room, crossing the line between the victim I was and the woman I was becoming. The morning sun didn't sting anymore. It spilled across the library's mahogany floorboards in warm, golden sheets, reflecting off the obsidian desk that had once felt like a barrier between a master and his servant. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, no longer a dark silhouette in a black and white uniform. Today, I wore a dress of heavy charcoal silk that moved like liquid smoke against my skin, a fabric that didn't hide me but announced me. The silence of the Baek estate had changed. It was no longer the oppressive, sterile quiet of a place where I was meant to be invisible. It was the hushed, expectant stillness of a kingdom waiting for its heartbeat. I heard the rhythmic strike of Jin-Woo's footsteps approaching, but for the first time, my pulse didn't quicken with a familiar cadence of hypervigilance. There was no fear, only a deep, resonant recognition. Jin-Woo entered, stopping just inside the doorway to watch me. He was dressed in a dark, midnight blue suit, his hair perfectly slicked back, but the lethal edge he carried was tempered by the way his gaze softened when it landed on me. He walked toward me, not with the dominant intent of a boss, but with the steady pace of a partner. He didn't lift my chin this time. He didn't have to. I met his eyes with a steady, wide-awake gaze that held no traces of the broken girl who had scrubbed his floors with bleeding knuckles. I was no longer a survivalist scavenging for peace. I was the peace he had gone to war to protect. "The car is ready," he said, his voice a low, smooth vibration that felt like a shield around my heart. "The board is waiting." They need to see who is standing beside the dragon. I looked at my hands. They were still, the tremors of the past months finally silenced. I thought of Marcus, a shadow that had been swallowed by the sun. I thought of Victor and the rivals who had tried to use me as a message. They had expected a victim, a soft spot in Jin-Woo's armor. Instead, they had found the reason he became a monster. Let them look, I replied, my voice sounding richer and steadier than I ever thought possible. Jin-Woo offered his arm, a gesture of profound respect that signaled my new status to the world. As we walked out of the library together, I realized that I hadn't just traded one danger for another. I had traded a life of being hunted for a life of being the one who decided the hunt. I wasn't just a maid who had been noticed. I was the woman who had redefined his empire. As the heavy oak doors opened to the world outside, I didn't bow my head. I stepped into the light, finally home, not as a ghost, but as the heart of the House of Baek.